Right. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to Ethnicity Pay Gap, Get to Grips with Your Ethnicity Data. Oh, it's pinging left, right and center. Welcome to the third in the trilogy of our webinars for the Ethnicity Pay Gap. And today's session is called Getting to Grips with Your Ethnicity Data. I'm your host for this evening. My name is Jacqueline A. Hines, Joint Managing Partner of Synergised Solutions. Welcome. Right. Before we get going, I just need to go through a few housekeeping tips. And just to let you know that the event will be recorded, your microphones, not to disrupt the recording and the speaking. Also, if you do not wish to be recorded, could you turn your cameras off? And what I will say is, I will encourage you all to participate in the healthy discussions. Put your questions in the chat box or put your hand up at the right moment, but also to remain respectful of all contributions made. And I'll repeat again, could I ask you that you all remain muted during the presentation of the webinar? Okay. Right, so I'd like to introduce the Synergised Solutions team. There is Diane Grayson, Managing Partner, Synergised Solutions Limited, and she's the founder of the hashtag Ethnicity Pay Gap campaign. There's myself, as I mentioned before, my name is Jacqueline Hines. I'm a joint managing partner of Synergised Solutions as well. And then also is Nicole Peterson. She's our associate with Synergised Solutions, and she's the hashtag Ethnicity Pay Gap campaign millennial ambassador. Get my teeth around that. So this is the team for Synergised Solutions. Right, I'm going to hand over to Nicole, who's going to take you through the journey so far.
Good evening, all. Yes, apologies about that, Jacqueline. I was the one that came up with the name Millennial Ambassador, and it was a bit of a mouthful, so yeah. So I'd just like to welcome everyone to the third webinar. My job today is just to take you guys on a brief run through of the events so far. So the first event of the series was titled hashtag Ethnicity Pay Gap Breaking the Silence. And that event was hosted by myself and delivered by myself. And that was all about simply just breaking the silence about inequalities around pay, the hashtag Ethnicity Pay Gap. It's something that I recently came across. I only heard about the Ethnicity Pay Gap through Diane, who was the founder of the campaign, in around June last year. And that just goes to highlight how many things that are very like big gaping holes that are happening within society that are not being addressed. So the first event was all about addressing those issues that are not normally addressed, bringing it to the forefront and giving people also the confidence and the information that they need so that they can also create change. It's okay telling people what the problem is, but how can we empower people and also help people to create those changes and be the changes for what's needed in the world today. So the first point that I said in that webinar is, in order for things to change, something has to be done differently. And in order for things for change to remain, things have to be done consistently. So it's all right, you know, finding out about all these bad things that are going on and saying, right, I'm going to make a difference, and doing a lot of dramatic things. It's about sustainable and practical things that need to be done so that these disparities can be removed. And this is what all this campaign is about, and also this series about providing people with practical measures so that they can create the changes that need to be seen. And also speaking out and breaking the silence can have a simple but yet profound effect when wanting to create change. So one person might be that person who creates that ripple effect so that change can happen. Those of you who might be unaware, Diane Grayson was the founder of the hashtag Ethnicity Pay Gap campaign that was founded in 2018. And because of these webinars, these series, the campaign, the t-shirts we're wearing today, was able to create this space and provide a movement so that change can happen. So that was the basis of the first webinar. I'll just put out some few stats for you so you can, those who are unaware. Currently, the most recent data that I've come across is that there's a 23.8% pay gap in London alone, and figures-wise in terms of numbers, the Guardian reported in 2018 that there was an ethnicity pay gap of £3.2 billion. So that's just two pieces of data information that I have given you today. There's so much more that I did go through in October, but that's just a little highlight of the first webinar. So moving on to the second one, which was titled Ethnicity Pay Gap, Time for Change. So this one was a build-up upon the, raising the alarm about the disparities that do exist. And this webinar took 3 people within their own environments, their organizations. We took 3 case studies and we had them on a panel. And it was just to empower people and also give people information on how they've got ethnicity pay reporting within their organizations, and to let people know that it is possible. It might be difficult, but there's 3 people here that spoke and shared their experiences on how the ethnicity pay gap can be brought to the fore within organizations as an issue that is important, because a lot of people have expressed that it's something that is forgotten about. However, if we move collectively in an organized way, that we can get it as something that is dealt with within our organizations and our workplaces. So yeah, that was the second installment of the Ethnicity Pay Gap series. It took place the day before as a precursor to the first ever Ethnicity Pay Gap Day, which was on Friday, the 8th of January. So around the campaign, there's been, like I said before, a lot of work going on. There's the t-shirts, there's the webinars, and also there's a online social media campaign where you can also get involved. There'll be more information about that later on by using the hashtag Ethnicity Pay Gap hashtag on social media. So moving on that evening, we asked the panel various different questions. We asked them, if you can bring the slide, what was their driver to report the ethnicity pay gap, and what process did they undertake? Also, what challenges did they face, and what was found from undertaking the analysis? So all of them had different answers to that. And this is to highlight that there's no one size fits all way of dealing with ethnicity pay gap or ethnicity pay gap reporting within organizations. There's tailor-made ways of dealing with it. However, it is possible. And that is what we want to empower people this evening. I won't go into it too much, and the speaker later on will share the information, but it is possible and it is out. We're just here to highlight and let people know that with the right tools and the right information, that we can get ethnicity pay gap reporting, something that can help reduce inequalities in society. So next slide, thank you. Thank you. So the event, it did multiple things. It built, like I said before, it built on the first webinar, and it provided an opportunity for the guests to ask their personal questions, any issues that or any uncertainties that they had, or frustrations even, they had around ethnicity pay gap reporting. And it's not only about pay as well, it highlights issues around progression within organizations. There is a lot of things that the ethnicity pay gap can actually reveal about an organization. And it also enabled people to ask questions on what's best, how to capture their data, and things like, issues as well. So people might wanting to disclose their ethnicity, and how ways that the organizations or the people within the panel were able to encourage their staff to get on board with ethnicity pay gap reporting. And attendees were also able to see the aspect of knowledge of the panel. The panels were taken from 3 different organizations, so they had their own perspectives, and they were all at different levels in their journey. And that's what we want to highlight here as well. This is a journey, so I'm speaking to you about the journey so far. I'm quite early in my journey. I really found out about this last year, but we all can work together, and no matter where we are within our journey, within organizations, our levels of power and influence, we all can add to this campaign in a unique way. So we all can reach towards that common goal of equality. And the final point, which I have mentioned before, and it's to educate and empower people. So regardless of where you are, you can always learn. You can always learn from people that have gone before you, some people that are don't know as much, but have a different perspective, and it's about sharing views, and also help people to support and get involved in the campaign, and also show their support towards the Ethnicity Pay Gap campaign, and make it more something that's more visible on social media, so that we can see the changes that we want to see. And it also highlighted the Ethnicity Pay Gap Day, which was on the 8th of January 2021. That was the first ever event to highlight Ethnicity Pay Gap Day. It was very successful. Many people got involved. They showed their solidarity and support to the campaign by wearing t-shirts, such as the one I'm wearing today, using the hashtag Ethnicity Pay Gap hashtag. Also, you can also purchase the event, and it's also an annual event. So you know about it now. You might have missed out. You might have been unaware of it before, but no doubt next year you can get involved, and you don't have to wait until Ethnicity Pay Gap Day to promote the Ethnicity Pay Gap. You can still use it in your hashtags and your posts. It's free, so there's no reason why you can't get involved and support it. And for me now, the journey continues. Where are we now today in terms of Ethnicity Pay Gap? I'm sure many of you will be aware the report came out earlier this year, the end of March, and Ethnicity Pay Gap reporting was covered in the Race and Ethnic Disparities report released in March 2021. And I'm sure all of you have your own views about what was said in the report. However, it was good to see that Ethnicity Pay Gap was actually mentioned. And I will say the 2 points that were in there. The first point that jumped out to me was that it said, Ethnicity Pay Gap reporting is potentially a useful tool, but needs to be approached with care. Reported ethnicity pay data should be disaggregated by different ethnicities to provide the best information possible. The pay gaps, once identified, should be reviewed to gain an understanding of why they exist in different organizations. And that point there, I do agree with. Like I've said in the webinars before, the Ethnicity Pay Gap does have some flaws. It does take just the pay of BAME employees, and then it just does it versus non-BAME or white employees within a workplace, which is problematic. So the point where it says it should be disaggregated into different ethnicities is something I definitely agree with. However, the report does go on to say we recognise the appetite that some employers have to act and publish their ethnicity pay gaps. A number of private and public sector employers, such as the NHS, have already voluntarily published their ethnicity pay gaps. We believe that ethnicity pay gaps should continue to be reported on a voluntary basis, and that the government should provide guidance to employers who choose to do so. And that point there, I don't really agree with, because it's something that I believe is very important. If you give it to people in a voluntary sense, most of the time people probably just don't do it. Like the census was put out last month, I believe, and they made it mandatory. You get a fine, because I'm pretty sure a lot of people, if they didn't have to do it, they wouldn't have done it. And this is not something, it's equality, it's equity. It's not something that should be a choice. It should be something that we all should be involved in and doing. So that is the end of my piece, and just hope that you understand the journey so far, and you gain and understand and learn more about what you will receive later on today. And I will hand back over to the host. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Right, as the title says, get to grips with your ethnicity data. Nicole's given you an overview, and for those of you that have been on the journey with us with webinar 1, where Nicole, as the millennial ambassador for the Ethnicity Pay Gap campaign, she outlined in the webinar her views, but also broke it down so that individuals who joined could ask those informed questions. The second one, as she mentioned, was more empowering because we got to hear from 3 individuals from different areas. Now, the third and final in the trilogy, Get to Grips with Your Ethnicity Data, is something to build upon even more and to take action at the end. Now, our special guest speaker is Anthony Horrigan. Anthony is the CEO and co-founder of Spectral, the pay gap specialists. Having left a computing science degree early to pursue his dreams, Anthony served for 25 years as a navigator and then a fighter pilot in the Royal Air Force. In his spare time, when not upside down, he developed software tools for the RAF, one of which won him an award. On leaving the military, Anthony got the chance to get involved with the emergency gender pay gap reporting process, and he leapt at the chance. Spectral are passionate about the use of technology to empower organizations to create equal futures by giving them the tools to make better people decisions with their data. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our guest speaker, who is Anthony Horrigan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this third event. The way I think we should do it is I'll kind of do a bit of speaking for a bit, and then when I lose the ability to speak, we can have a bit of a discussion. The size of the discussion depends on the kind of content. So you'll see in the middle there, we've got quite a big time for discussing. And that's really the meat of actually how you should go about doing this, actually to prevent some of the problems that Nicole highlighted in her bit as well. So we'll just go through each bit and then we'll kind of have a little summary and then a discussion and then we'll move on and then we'll hand back over at the end to Jacqueline. So where to start? I think the most important thing is, the health warning. You won't get this right first time. It's very rare that people get it right. And from most of the reports that are out there at the moment, some of them are a hit and a little bit of a strike. Some of them are a hit and a miss. However, if you approach this as a journey, just like everybody said so far, and you engage people, then it gives you the kind of the right to refine it and to get better and to learn more. And most importantly, as we'll discover, to actually listen, which is one of the most important things in this process. Now, the little kind of diagram I'm going to show you, you can start anywhere on it, but actually the most important thing is the culture. Now, your organization may not have that culture to start with, but most definitely the very most fundamental thing is that you need to realize that without a changing culture, without an acceptance that actually things are not fine, and unlike page 116 to 118 of the report we've spoken about, well, just do it voluntarily. It's fine. It doesn't need to be mandatory like gender. There is no, it's difficult to do. Let's just, if you're going to do it, fine. It's not like that. There are disparities and they need to be addressed. So in the first instance, that kind of top-down direction is absolutely critical. Secondly, the kind of purpose. Again, before you actually tell people the purpose, you've got to decide it as an organization. Why are we doing this? And that's really, really important. Once that has kind of been decided, then you need to communicate that. In the first instance, you need to communicate it to your organization, to all your staff, to get their buy-in, to actually not just try and do this in isolation, in HR, either one person, as is the case normally with gender pay gap reporting, but actually with a team of multidisciplinary people to actually approach this and actually think, what's our purpose? What are we going to do? Get everybody on board. Only then should you start to actually think about collecting the data. Because as Nicole said before, actually just asking somebody what their ethnicity is very different to knowing probably 99% of the time what somebody's gender is, remembering that you can get gender from PAYE. So actually you have to be actually going out and asking people's ethnicity, which can bring a lot of problems if you don't do these first steps first and actually get buy-in from your employees. And then, as we said, listening, feedback. At every step of the way, when you're deciding who you want to be and who you are at the moment and the distance between those 2 points, what your purpose in doing this process is, the communications you're having, and as you start to collect and validate the data, you need to be listening. We will start to talk about, obviously, there are certain terms which are people, are not happy with being used, but that will change on an organization by organization basis. And just like the old adage, it doesn't matter what you decide on in the end, you probably won't please all of the people all of the time. So you've just got to keep listening. So it all comes down to communication. Without that, it just is something that is seen to be done, doesn't really have an effect, and there's no kind of feedback loop. Listening and learning just means you're actually approaching this in a human way, recognizing that people are different, and you've just got to listen to what they say. And just remember, a lot of organizations that we deal with, they started with a kind of collection rate on data because they were asking, when they were onboarding employees, they had less than 20% ethnicity data. So it's an iterative process. The more you communicate, the more you tell people why you're doing it, what your purpose is, the more buy-in you'll get, you'll build trust, and people will actually realize that actually, I do get what you're trying to do, and actually I will give you the information so you can do a better job with that. I suppose the second part about that is quite a popular misconception, which is people saying you can't ask that, you can't record that data. The second part to that is that people then cite the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations, as a barrier to collecting this information. And actually, it's quite the opposite. GDPR is actually the framework that you should use to actually follow and collect this data, because it gives you all of the tools you need to make sure you're doing this in a responsible way. There are some points. Obviously, when you come to this, we've already said that communication is key. So you actually start to fulfill the framework for GDPR by telling people why you're collecting it. Also, because people have to provide this to you, you are implicitly asking for their consent when they give that information. And as long as you put something that says, this is what I'm going to use it for, and this is how long I'm going to keep the information, then that is a really, really good start. You can also add, this is how we're going to make sure the information is secure, and this is how we're going to check and make sure the information is as up to date as possible. And finally, you have to tell people who's going to be able to access it, what it's going to be used for, and most importantly, if they do want to withdraw their consent, how they go about doing it. So it's I think there's only a few steps in it, but it is most definitely not a barrier. It is the framework that can be used to actually, get this going and show people a little bit of kind of structure around it, and maybe build trust so that people are, actually more inclined to give you the information. So I don't know if anybody's got any questions on that first bit. That was a nice little easy leading to it. So I'm happy to take any questions on that.
I haven't seen anything in the chat yet, but does anybody want to raise their hands and ask any questions at this particular moment?
The questions come from the chat from Heather. Would you like me to read it?
Yes, please.
When should you collect the data if not at onboarding stage?
That's good. So there you go. Communication. I wasn't very clear there. I think that's a good time to collect it, but I don't think it's the only time to collect it. It's a bit like the evolution that's happened in companies where they actually try and get employee feedback. Going from a once every year we'll do a survey to more of a kind of pulse survey has been proven to be a lot more effective. And I think that's the kind of thing that needs to happen when you're collecting data. Remember, you've already stated the purpose, you've already stated the kind of boundaries, what it's going to be used for, what it won't be used for, how secure it is. So maintaining that message and increasing it, and maybe actually attaching some little metrics to it. Like at the moment, we've got 20% return rate on the data. All we can tell you is the demographics of 20% of our population. as you get to 40, 50%, you can start to describe the company that's emerging from this data, and you can get people involved and get people actually having a vested interest in getting this to a stage where you can start to actually look at the data and make some, statistical insights from it.
Anybody else want to add a question to the chat box or use your emoji to ask a question?
Can you ask a question with an emoji?
Yes, you
I
want to put your hand up.
Oh, that's fine.
Right. Okay, I've got one from Robert. What is HR's role in this process?
I think after it's been, signed off and brought in by senior leadership, it needs to be handed over to, as I said, a multidisciplinary team to actually run with it. And I think HR is a good place for this to be done. You don't just need HR. You are going to need, when you're talking about the data, you're going to need payroll. In certain organizations, you may need risk and compliance. You definitely want to get, if you have a diversity and inclusion kind of team, you want to get them involved. But a good place to actually hold this is in HR, because this is business intelligence. And hopefully we're seeing this kind of shift from HR just being the people that are just a cost center to actually a source of huge business intelligence, and the place where, there is a nexus of actually making sure that people feel like they can, bring their whole selves to work and actually move forwards and do well in a company. So, yeah, I think HR is a good place to actually kind of own this, as it were.
Right, we've got another one from Paul Irving. It's quite a long one. Shall I read it out quickly?
Yes, because I can't see my chat box.
Yeah. So Paul says, Labour being but one of the 10 major areas of people activity, the system of white supremacy / racism functions in. Why call this ethnicity, not the race pay gap? That's one question. And then, yeah, it goes on, but I think I'll answer that one first before we go on to anything else.
Yeah, and this is the whole point about listening. I don't know enough about the difference between race and ethnicity to actually comment on that. But this is the kind of thing that needs to be spoken about. And this is where learning needs to happen. If you think about it, let's just get a higher level view. Let's talk about gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, disability. What we're trying to say is you probably are sitting on data in an organization that you can use to, first of all, look at who you are as a company, and then to actually see if the representation of these different protected groups and the intersectionality of them, so, Black women, for instance, have they got the same chance of moving up the organization as other groups like white men? So yes, there is a lot of sensitivity around what you call things, ethnicity, race. However, the overall aim, the purpose that needs to be kind of bought into is that whatever you do, all you're trying to do is look for those barriers, whether it be a person, a process, or a system that's preventing all different types of people moving through your organization at the rate they want to move, not at the rate that you enforce because of something you're not aware of, like a bias or a system.
Right.
Okay, we've got quite a lot of questions coming through, but I'm only going to do one more for now, and we'll pick the rest up later, because obviously we want to talk. We've got time scale. From Imran, PhD students looking at ethnic inequalities in health. How can ethnicity data be better recorded from a societal perspective? There are so many gaps investigating ethnicity. Sorry, put my teeth back in. Ethnicity as opposed to looking at socio-economic inequalities. Any thoughts on this intersectionality between socio-economic status and ethnicity?
Yeah, it's an important point. I think what you've got to realize is there are just under 11,000 organizations in the UK that have to report their gender pay gap statistics. When I first looked at this in the first year, about 30% of them were doing it wrong. And that is an equation that goes man minus woman divided by man. There were people doing woman minus man divided by woman. There were people doing something completely different. There were people putting in their quarter information the wrong way round, all manner of different errors. I think you need to start somewhere. I think it was good that it was started with gender. I absolutely disagree with the fact that ethnicity pay gap analysis is not being made mandatory, because it just gives people another excuse not to do things. Socio-economic, social mobility, the intersection of all different characteristics, that's where it needs to get to. It needs to be, as I've said before, a very simple case of going, there should be no barrier to any one type of person saying, I want to be at the top and get in there. And anything you can do to look at the data to actually say, it's not a person that's stopping you getting there, it's actually a process that we've got. It's our onboarding process. It's our recruitment. It's where we look for people. It's how we educate and promote people. So anything where you can look at the data and see that there are clusters of people that just don't seem to be moving, that's got to be a good thing. But yeah, you can't run before you walk. And people have had a hard enough time actually getting their head around gender, even before we move on to ethnicity.
Apologies, I know that I said I was going to let you carry on with the presentation, but yeah. Norma had her hand up. So Norma, I don't know if you want to say what you need to say briefly. Norma, are you there?
Oh, yes. Sorry, I was thinking to myself. I was going to say I can go on and on about the difference between ethnicity and race. But what I always say when I give talks about it is we need to be aware that it's not what you or who you define yourself is that people treat you as. It's what you look like. So that's where the nuance between ethnicity and race comes in, because I could identify as white and tick the white ethnicity box, but at work they look at me and they say, that's a Black woman, and they're going to treat me as such. So it's a bit tricky there. So I understand when people say, why is it not called a race box? Because it would really target people easier if it's called a race pay gap. But that's all I wanted to say.
That's a very good point, and it's yeah, I totally get that. And if you think that the way that statistics should work is that before you just say let's go and do ethnicity or race pay gap analysis, what you've got to ask is, what are we trying to solve? What do we think the problem is? And then you need to collect the data that you think will best give you the clues to actually go on that hunt to find what the problem is. So if the problem is more that if you say for recruitment, you had 10 people in a row, and if the problem is a white recruiter will probably choose a white person because you kind of go with, hey, I'm like this, let's go with something I know, then obviously exactly correct. You need to make sure that the data you're collecting actually represents the thing you're trying to get proof on. But again, this is why we, say that process. So this has got to be a discovery process. You've got to, say, what's the purpose? We're trying to make it fairer for everybody. And then if you do open it up to your employees to give you feedback and they come up with something as valid as what you've said, you need to build that in. And if you need to do a slightly different process, or actually do, processes where you go, okay, we are now living in a multiverse, different reality, and the government have actually made ethnicity pay gap reporting mandatory. Why not do a race pay gap analysis and actually skew it to that point of view and actually say, we're not going to ask you what your ethnicity is. How do you identify? What's your race? And then see if you get the same result. So then you'll have a kind of quite a close comparator. So yeah, definitely. And that's all about the listening and the feedback.
Thank you, Anthony. Well, you may continue.
Oh, thank you. Okay, now we're going to move on to my favorite bit, which is kind of the data. And the way it works is you could take you could ask people, you know, a multitude of different things, but when you actually come to examining data, you need to actually start to look at it, and you need to start kind of validating it and sifting through it, and actually get to a stage where when you're going to actually apply some kind of calculation to it, you know that you've got it to a state where it's actually, you know, in good order to actually be examined. So, and that is actually a very important part of the process, which is, it's again taken as, you know, read that it's done with gender, but it's a very different kettle of fish when it comes to ethnicity. However, another health warning, as I said at the start, all organizations are different, and the fundamental truth is there is no single right way. There are just lots of not bad ways that you can experiment with, and definitely a couple of huge no-nos that you can end up putting yourself in a situation where people will just be slamming you. I mean, I'm sure everybody's aware in 2018, when the first results were coming out for, in fact, it was late 2017 into 2018, when people were starting to release their gender pay gap. There was no such thing as a news article that mentioned gender pay gap reporting that also didn't mention a single percentage. 32.6, 54.5 for Barclays Bank, you know, things like that. However, you need to put it into context. That is the, you know, boiling down of a whole organization to one number. So actually, when you say it out loud, you think, well, that doesn't sound right. So there's definitely things that need to be kept in mind when you start to go through this process. Secondly, we talked about listening and learning and evolving, and thankfully, it looks like the government are slightly evolving, because they are now saying that the term BAME should not be used, which is brilliant, because apart from it being, you know, mildly offensive or extremely offensive to certain people, it also doesn't cover what people think it covers. It actually starts to cover, you know, color and ethnicity, and research has shown that actually people don't quite understand exactly what it is. Now, just like in the process of the whole evolution and purpose and listening and learning, we have got to a stage at Spectral where we are happier with the term GEM, so global ethnic majority. We think from a data point of view, it's a lot more accurate, because globally, you know, ethnic majorities are not white. So actually it kind of sets the tone correctly. We don't like ethnic minority, but again, that's just us. When we speak to companies, if we're going to be doing reports for them like this, then we will listen to what they are saying. And also we will encourage them to speak to their employees to see what their employees are thinking. So again, there's no one right answer. A bit like with gender, how often do you hear about, you know, the gender pay gap, which was male, female, and also considering non-binary? You just don't hear it. It's just male versus female. So, you know, there's definitely a journey that people need to go on. Let's just start with a couple of statistics just to put this into context. So we've mentioned gender. Across the UK workforce, we're talking 55%, 45% male, female-ish, with a little bit of change in between. However, it's really different when you look at ethnicity. Across the UK, for the people that are of employment age, it's 12% GEM population. That rises to around about 34% in London, but so very different from gender. So it's just one of those areas where we really need to keep this in mind, because we're correct that when we say that people doing a white versus other people report, it's that non-disaggregation of people is bad. However, you might have such a small number of people that aren't white that breaking them down any further may contravene GDPR by personally identifying people, or just maybe statistically inaccurate just because you're talking about one or two people. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. But basically, you do have a problem. And the problem is, instead of male, female, you're looking at a minimum of 18 categories from the 2011 census. And as we know, the census that's going on at the moment, when the results of that come out, that may change again, because, you know, they are asking people, you know, where they actually consider themselves to sit, and those categories may change. Now, the difference between the census and when you're collecting data for kind of pay gap analysis is that you also need to consider two further categories, which are people that tell you that they would prefer not to say, and also where you've just got a blank, where you haven't been able to get the data. Maybe that person is covered under, you know, the gender pay gap legislation, but they're a contractor and you just don't know or haven't asked what their ethnicity is. So you need to kind of get it to the stage where you've got probably these 7 categories, from Asian, Black, mixed, other, white, and then prefer not to say, and no data. That's good, but again, this kind of thing needs to be communicated to your employees, because you need to tell them how you're actually going to view them. You can't just lump everybody together under GEM or BAME or whatever and just expect them not to maybe have questions about, why did you put me in that group instead of that group? So again, a constant feedback of what you're doing and why you're doing it will at least give people a chance to actually realize that you are being sensitive about this and you're doing it for the right reasons. However, you've got to maintain, once you get into this area of it, you've got to maintain that kind of slant to, I need to have good data. I need to do this in a, you know, convincing, you know, way that actually I can look back on and say, I followed a process and this is where I got to. So at some stages you are going to have to say, no, I'm going to put you in there because, now obviously you're not going to have those individual conversations, but when you actually talk about this, when you're presenting results, you need to actually lay out how you got to these categories and who you put in them. So that's pretty clear. Also, there's one other thing to think about. Everything we've spoken about so far, you may have to adjust for different audiences. So you may have to really go into the weeds of this when you're talking about your kind of team that you've put together to look at this. You may have to go into a reasonable amount of detail when you're talking to senior leadership. When you're talking to your internal stakeholders, your employees, etc., you may only want to go so far and give a certain amount of the picture. And then when you go external to, you know, to do onto your website, onto your potential new employees, onto your competitors, again, you may want to adjust what you say. So it's not a simple case of just getting a set of numbers and throwing them at a wall and just saying, look, there we are. It's very much an involved process. So just to do that first bit on the mapping, you need to consider that all organizations are unique and that you may have to change your process for a particular set of reasons that will be different from somebody else next to you. You also need to make sure that you describe the ethnicities. And again, take Norma's point, if you have to also do parallel work and actually say, we're also going to look at race and describe that, then you need to do that properly, because you will be responding to the voice of the people that are your most valuable asset, your employees. So you need to do that. You also, I would say that you should consider mapping to these 7 groups. If you're mapping to 20+ groups, the granularity that you're going to have will be great, but you may either have 0 or 1 or 2 people in some of those groups, and it just makes actually looking at the data unmanageable, and actually it won't tell you anything of interest. And whatever you do, you just have to keep communicating what you're doing, giving feedback. And again, a really good way to do this, and we're discussing this with a client at the moment, is via a town hall. And this is before you've got your results. This is actually to set out why you're doing it, what you're going to do, what the expected kind of outputs of it are, and to invite feedback and actually, you know, get the views of your employees, so that when it does come to the point of giving over data and having that confidence that you're going to do something, you know, noteworthy with it, they're bought in. So again, that's and that wasn't our idea. That came from a client, and we listened, and it looks like it's going to be a really good way of actually, you know, increasing overall awareness. So that's pretty much everything to do with kind of mapping. And hopefully, you know, this isn't a scare thing, but hopefully you can see there's a lot more to consider than just getting the HR file or the payroll file and seeing male and female, getting some amount of money and doing that simple calculation. Second thing is where people are really falling into the traps with doing these first ethnicity pay gap reports. It's a very human thing. What people are doing is going, hey, I've done gender. We'll rub out the name gender and we'll put the name ethnicity in there and we'll just crack on. And actually what we can do is we can say, you know, instead of male, we'll call it white. Instead of female, we'll call it gem. Done. That's it. However, there are some statistical reasons why that's pretty much a very bad idea. So if we look at this picture, you can see this is a typical organization split by gender, 55% male, 45% female. And all of the little orange men and women you can see there are GEM employees. So you can see that's what a rough company looks like for gender. If we assign some average pay values to that, we'll say that the average man in this company earns £15 and the average woman earns £13. So a couple of pounds difference. And what does that actually work out to? Well, in the gender pay gap legislation, works out to a gender pay gap of 13.3%, which is just over the average in the UK. So not bad. Now let's magically shuffle that data and actually see it from an ethnicity point of view. So you can see now that somebody has got a microphone on and are shuffling across the floor. Perfect. You can see now that there's been a massive change. Now you've got a huge group of white people on the left-hand side and a very small group of GEM employees on the right-hand side. Now, this doesn't necessarily, just like this, cause any problems right now. So let's just have a look and say, okay, the white employees on the left-hand side get on average £15 an hour. And on the right-hand side, the GEM employees get on average £14 an hour. Now, interestingly, that gives you half the pay gap that you had for gender, so 6.7%, so brilliant. And we see this a lot in reports, and we'll talk about a possible reason why, and Nicole alluded to it. We'll talk about that in a moment. But at the moment, all of a sudden, you imagine doing a gender and an ethnicity report, and you're saying, well, our ethnicity pay gap is half as big as our gender pay gap, so we're going really well. However, if you had, under the gender report, if you had a small change in the population of your females or a small change in the population of your males, it wouldn't have much of a difference to your overall number, and definitely not year on year. If you do nothing in an organization and you have a typical churn with people leaving, people joining, without things like furlough, your gender pay gap percentage will not change very much. It will just kind of very slowly ebb and flow. However, if we look at ethnicity, and there's our average £14 an hour, but we lose our Asian director at the top of our GEM population, and it takes our average pay down to £10 an hour. Now we end up with an ethnicity pay gap of 33.3%. And that is one of the first dangers with ethnicity pay gap analysis. It's that a small change in a small sample can have a big overall effect if the other side of the equation has got a big sample that is not as easily affected by one or two people leaving. So that is the first thing. And if you look at most ethnicity pay gap reports that are released at the moment, they're still focusing on pay gap figures. They're not actually talking about anything else too much. It's mainly the pay gap figures. So again, there's a big warning there about doing that. Secondly, and don't worry, we're going to make this chart a lot better in a moment. This is, I think this is actually from the 2011, is it from the 2011 census? Basically, what this shows is the ethnicity pay gaps for all non-white employees and how those pay gaps have changed from 2012 through to 2018. And as you can see, all of those different lines, there's a massive change on them. But actually what we can do, and what the ONS do, and what people do in their ethnicity pay gaps, is to simplify it and just kind of wave a wand and go, actually, that's 5.8%. So if you look at white versus GEM, it is a 5.8% ethnicity pay gap. However, let's just take a closer look at all these lines, and let's just zero in on a couple. So we have Black, African, and Caribbean, which is the red top line, and then we have the blue Chinese. Now, what this is saying is that the average Black employee only earns 92 pence to every pound that the average white person earns. And the average Chinese employee in 2018 actually earns £1.32 for every £1 that the Chinese employee, that the white employee earns. So you can see just within that 5.8% figure, actually there's a huge difference between different ethnicities. So this goes to that little paragraph in page 116 of the report that talks about disaggregating data. And it just shows you that you can actually suppress pretty big numbers just by having a really positive story in amongst a not so good story. The only reason I didn't choose Chinese and Bangladeshi workers was that the chart was too tall, because Bangladeshi workers earn about 60 something pence to every pound that an average white worker earns. So it's even worse than these two categories chosen here. So again, not saying don't do it, but you need to be aware that unlike gender, you need to have this kind of zoom lens where you can zoom out and look at the population as a whole and zoom in and look at the individual stories, because both of them contain data points that you need to actually consider. So far, a little bit like the report, and I'm sorry to keep banging on it, but it was rubbish. A little bit like the report, all we've kind of talked about are problems and what is, what you shouldn't do and what's bad and what doesn't give you the kind of answers you're looking for. So now let's have a look at actually what we can use, because that's a lot more interesting. Now, we know from our original chart, there's our company, and now we're seeing it in a different way. We're seeing everybody together. We're seeing that the white characters are our white employees, and the orange characters are our GEM employees. Now, if we look at the gender pay gap legislation, it says what you need to do is assign a monetary value, an hourly rate to every single person, and then mark them from the highest earners to the lowest earners. And then what you need to do is cut that long list into 4 equal chunks. So you cut it from 4 equal chunks, and you start at the upper, which is the 25% highest earners, all the way down to the lower, the 25% lowest earners. This is pretty much where the legislation stops. All it tells you now to do is look at each of those 4 chunks and look at the balance of men and women. And in our case, we're looking at the balance of white people and GEM people within those 4 quarters. What it doesn't do is suggest you do something which actually, by seeing the data like this, becomes a no-brainer, which is actually to go back and consider what our initial overview of the company was, which is 86% white and 40% GEM. So can we mute whoever's, there we go. Right, so overall 86%, 14%. And now, even without loads of statistics and figures, just visually, you can now see that there are a couple of big problems in this company. So forget about that, 6.7% pay gap. Actually, the problem's a lot bigger, because there are 2 things that leap out to me. Firstly, we've got way too many GEM employees in the bottom 25%. We should only have 3 figures down there. And most importantly, why have we only got 1 figure at the top? So to actually do the data like this is a lot more powerful and a lot more meaningful than just coming out with a single percent. Because a percent you can put excuses next to. An actual real deep dive into the representation of different people throughout the pay range of your organization and where there are gaps is the only real way to actually show what's happening. And if you think about it, and this is something, again, people tend to kind of either forget, not know, or just ignore. When you look at your data, it's historical. And I don't mean you're looking at your data for 2020 and you're looking at it now, as a lot of people are, you know, over a year late.
I'll put my
But
headphones
it's
on, so
historical from the point of view of decades.
I can find them. I'll do them.
Can somebody please be in charge of muting people? Thank you. So actually, it's a historical view of the company overall. So you need that evidence, because you then need to discover why there are twice as many GEM employees in the bottom 25%, and why you've only got 33% of the GEM employees you should have in the upper 25%. So again, it's not meant as a you know, slamming things and, you know, throwing these figures up and saying this is wrong. It's meant as a, let's have a look at this. Let's have a look in there and see why people are not making it from the bottom 25% into the next, and trying to actually figure out what the barriers are. So that's mapping and analysing. And I think the four biggest takeaways are, it's massively different to gender, and it shouldn't be underestimated, but it is still possible to do a really good job. I'll break a rumor, size is important. So actually having a big sample and a small sample, you've got to be really careful with the statistics there, because one, they could be kind of telling you a little bit of a lie, and two, if there's a small change in a small sample year on year, then it will change your numbers drastically, and actually you'll just be on the back foot trying to actually describe why your number's gone up by 20%. As Nicole said, beware of masking stories of different ethnicities. If you don't have that many people that aren't white, then you may not be able to get to the granularity of saying this is the pay gap for this particular group, but you do actually need to go and check and see where the representation is, and if it actually matches the overall representation in your organization. And again, use the word representation. Representation is 10 times more meaningful than a pay gap figure. It's something that is actually a little bit more robust, and it will actually stand up to the weathers of certain one person, two people leaving a group, and actually tracking that year on year to make sure that people are moving up is a lot more powerful than just throwing up a percentage. And that is mapping and analysing. Apart from a couple of...
Okay, so thank you very much for that, Anthony. I know we've got quite a few questions, but Diane, Nicole, have you got any questions here that spring to mind?
Yeah, sorry, there isn't any specific questions to this point, so I want to leave the other ones for later so we could just go through them. So specifically, here we've got one from Heather. It says, could you analyse this multiple times a year?
Yes. Yeah, you just need to have a process in place that does it. You've also got to realise that yes, you could do it, but progress, even with gender, even with lots of things in place, this is still about people, and this is what people forget. It's about people, and sometimes people don't move. Sometimes churn rates in companies are quite low. However, having this business intelligence, at least you can actually use that time where things aren't changing to actually properly map where people are and why they're not moving. And again, companies, you don't just get rid of people at the top to make room for people. However, when it comes to something like positive action, having a proper overview of this data and being able to say, we now got positions opening, we may use positive action to actually increase representation with this group of people in this area, you've got everything standing by. So yes, you can do it more than once, but don't expect just because you've increased frequency to increase progress.
Right, there's another one.
Yeah, another question from Ollie. It says, how do you earn the trust of employees to provide the data that is necessary to carry out a pay gap review?
Be human. Admit that you don't know the whole story. Admit that you don't know exactly what you're doing, but say that you're doing it, convey the purpose. You're doing it for the right reasons because you actually want to reduce inequality and you actually want to do the right thing. If you look at it from a business point of view, If you've got naysayers at the very top, then diversity of thought is the biggest increase to the bottom line. Just having a bunch of people, what is it, snowy white peaks, groupthink, having all the same idea, would never be as good as a diverse group of people adding to a rich kind of, conversation about where they think it should go. So be human, talk, communicate, listen. And if you're sitting in an organization where you're saying, well, that just doesn't happen in our organization, then that's a clue to actually consider, what can I do to change the culture? How can I try and convince people above me that actually we're not going to get the data because people don't trust us? And maybe it is a conversation with somebody saying, we're not trusted. People don't trust us. And then there's a very simple decision that needs to be made. Do we want our people to be with us, or are we quite happy with the status quo? And the only thing I'd say to the status quo is the dinosaur theorem. This is evolution. Hopefully, as slow and as painful as it is, we are evolving into wanting to be fairer and actually allow people to bring everything they are to work. And so if it doesn't happen in certain organizations, I do hope eventually they die out, because there is no place for it. So we're not saying don't get activist and make it all happen now, but actually doing this in a right way and communicating and listening and involving is the only thing to do.
Okay.
Thank you.
I've got a question.
Go on then.
Sorry.
Can I jump in? Right. How do you tackle an organization that should do their ethnic pay gap reporting, but omit it intentionally because it's too much hard work? How do you highlight that to them, that it's the right thing to do?
It depends what you mean by hard. So there's different angles to that. I can't remember who said it, but there was somebody was saying, let's not call out people, let's call in. So I suppose it's the difference between lining people up against a wall and going, you're wrong, and getting everybody in a huddle and going, come on, better. So, that could be one barrier. A barrier to why it's difficult. Yeah, I mean, the report didn't help that all it did was come up with 2 pages of why it's difficult. But there are solutions. And actually, if you try and step away from the maths, try and step away from everything and just ask a question, just want to get a sense of what we look like at the moment, and if that's the same up through the whole of the company, you can start small. Again, if you think back to the first section, iteration, you're not going to do this all overnight. However, if you start off and just each time you make a decision, you make an informed decision with a diverse set of people that are all got the same purpose, which is to make things a bit fairer, then the chances are you may meander around a bit like pinball, whacking off the sides a bit, but you'll probably go in the right direction. If you do nothing, or if you just try and do it exactly like gender and just blinkers on, it won't really work for you. So it is a slow process. Some people have been quick to get on it and have just gone down the gender route and just done it. And some people have been a little bit slower and actually come out with something a little bit more thoughtful. And that kind of thing does get noticed, especially by, new generation of people coming into the workplace. They are paying more attention to that kind of sentiment, that purpose, that kind of culture. So it will eventually seep in.
Right, so we've got one more. We've got another question.
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony.
Another question. Should companies set targets for representation of GEM employees at each level?
So myself and my non-exec director have slightly different opinions on this. And I think because we're diverse and we speak about it, I think I now accept a little bit more of what he says, and hopefully he accepts a little bit more I say. You need both. So what you need are targets and outcomes. I think outcomes are actually more powerful. So you actually say, this is where we want to get to, but then you use a target to see if it's working. What you can't just do is just set targets, because if you just set targets and don't meet them, you will lose people along the way, and you may actually lose your own confidence and actually go, why are we doing this? It's not working. Whereas if you actually set outcomes, we're going to remove that from the process of recruitment. We're going to do this. I want to next year not be hiring people from white man and white man limited. I want to actually get people from every man, every person. So things like that are powerful. So, but again, there is no one single answer. It's definitely, in the first instance, who is it who said it? Thomas Aquinas, know thyself. So you just need to know what your organization is to start with. If you start there, you've got a point on a map. Then if you choose to go in a certain direction, you know where you're coming from, so you can see even the minutest of progress that you've made, and it will actually spur you on to bigger things. If you want to put targets along the way, be careful, but yeah, why not? Just don't try and, you have to do it with a certain amount of mathematical validity in place. You can't, there was a report that came out that pretty much said by 2021 or 2022, we want to have 40% on the board. And you look at the representation through the company and go, wow, that's going to require a paradigm shift in the representation you've got in the company. It's pretty much impossible. So why not make a slightly lower target that actually you've worked out by doing scenario planning you can actually achieve with a good bit of work. So again, there's pluses and minuses to it, but yeah, on the whole, targets, yes.
Thank you for that. Is there anybody else that'd like to ask a question at this moment in time in this particular section? And don't be shy. Can't see any hands up.
Good.
And no,
I've confused everybody with the pictures.
yeah, and there's nothing more in the chat.
Brilliant.
So
Right,
if you'd like to continue, if you
Sure.
are.
Okay, so home stretch.
Sorry, sorry, Anthony.
I'm back.
Somebody's raised their hand.
Cheekily came through. Oh, actually, two people actually came through.
Two people. Yeah.
Oh, no, I've just lost them. Oh, is it Enoch? Yes.
Yep, that's me. Thank you.
Yes.
So, Anthony, you're probably very knowledgeable on what's happening in the regulation side of things. So there's now regulation around gender, pay gap, pay analysis reporting. Do you know what's happening in the ethnicity space currently with regards to regulation?
Yeah, I think we can take the clues from page 117 of the report, which pretty much, it doesn't explicitly say what it implies is we don't see this as important as gender, because if we did, we'd make it mandatory like gender. However, also think on the fact that gender isn't seen as highly important because it's either suspended or 6 months delayed. And this is for companies that have got 250 or more employees. So they should have the wherewithal to actually do a very simple set of numbers. So I don't think, and I don't want to get political at all because I don't think it should be a politics thing, but I honestly don't think the appetite is there at the moment. However, I would throw it back at you and say the appetite should be with the employees. And social pressure make this, more of an issue in companies. It is the right thing to do, and if companies aren't doing it, or at least set off on a journey to actually get to a stage where they can do it, then I think everybody should be asking questions. Why not? If you're doing this, why aren't you doing that? And then obviously that fundamentally leads on to, why aren't you just doing it agnostically and just looking and saying, have we got any barriers to people progressing through our company if they want to? Just like you would have to pass an audit on, do you have ramps so that people in wheelchairs can get into the front of your shop, into your offices? It should be the same. These are barriers. Some of them you can see, some of them you can't, and they should be sought out and taken away.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
I think there's something, RL, I don't know who RL is, had the hand up and it's disappeared. So RL, are you still wanting to speak?
Hi there, yes, we are. Hi, thanks for that. Just a quick question, actually, and it's I'm not sure how relevant it is, but I just wanted to understand. So in an organization, I work for a bank, an investment bank, and you know, since the kind of discussions have arisen around pay gaps and Black representation and the like within the bank, we've kind of worked together with HR and other parts of the organization to improve our statistics in any way that we can. But what I wanted to kind of get a guide on is when something like this is raised within an organization, and then, you know, it starts off very well and it's kind of focused on Black people who are kind of lacking in numbers, and then it moves wider into BAME, and then it kind of just gets diluted down, and the issue at hand that was initially spoken about is kind of eventually kind of sidetracked, and that's what I'm feeling now with the efforts that we were making. Is kind of being diluted down and given a much wider sphere to include BAME, gender, and everything else, whereas the focus was initially Black. And I'm just wondering, how would you kind of go about keeping the focus on what was the initial, you know, without excluding others, but, you know, just keeping it back to what the initial agenda was.
Okay, so planning, champions. So actually, if you think about it, just focusing on one group of people is the wrong thing to do. It could be a catalyst, but the fact that you're finding that it's going from a very specific to actually, what about this, what about that? Need to plan it and go, right, have we got to what we actually set off to do? Yes, no. If we haven't, we need to make sure we actually still keep working towards it. What you can do is have champions for each, you know, for each kind of aspect you're looking at, and actually make them hold you accountable. And there's no better, I mean, in my own organization, my biggest kind of critic is the youngest employee, because she's the one that's going to inherit, you know, my job, or the person that comes after me. So actually having her input and going, why aren't we doing that? What, I thought we said we were going to do this. Actually have somebody, you know, into a board meeting that's right at the very bottom of your company that says, yeah, but I thought the whole point was to do this. And actually, you know, have different meetings with these different people and actually get held accountable. But yeah, it is difficult, especially when, you know, you try and do it and it's actually quite involved in the first instance, and then it starts to kind of spear off and you find other things. But the only way around it is to actually have a, you know, the purpose. This is what the purpose of this is, and these are the outcomes we want, and just keep working towards. If you start to get off track, either have somebody else to bring you back and accountable, or actually use a process to actually do it. But it's difficult. It's so very different to just doing a quick male versus female done, let's move on. But this is the future of work. You know, the future should be fairer. So actually it's going to take a huge amount of work to actually get there, but you've got to start. And it sounds like you started, so it's good momentum. You just need to focus in and maybe go, okay, we have got 3 or 4 specific strands, and we're going to need to appoint somebody to each of them that will hold us accountable for the work we do. So
yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
I just want to, sorry, carry on.
A question from Lemuel. Will reporting this pay gap data eventually lead to retroactive pay?
So what you may be confusing is equal pay with pay gap. So, and again, it's not your fault. This is the fault of the actual words that are used to describe them. So actually, it shouldn't really be called pay gap reporting. It should be called representation. So gender representation, ethnicity representation. So all we're speaking about is the fact that 100 and something years ago, a company was formed by a bunch of old white men. And then about 50 years ago, they allowed some women to come into the company. And then even less than that, they allowed people that weren't white to come into the company. And where are we now? It's a gross, you know, simplification of it. But that's what the gender representation is about. Equal pay is about anybody with a protected characteristic having the right to similar pay for similar or equivalent work, which is very different. That obviously is illegal. under the 2010 Equality Act. And if anybody, if you thought that that was happening, then that's, instant, retribution in terms of remuneration and fines and everything. Massive process that I don't know a whole lot about, but it's, very overt, and you can easily bring a claim. Whereas representation, it has always been, because if you think about it, if you take a snapshot and then never look at it again, that's your representation. What you actually need is time series data to show that year on year, things are not changing. Those particular group of people that are certain characteristics never move above the middle pay of the company. At that stage, that's the kind of thing that can be taken forwards, and why is this happening? But I don't think you'd ever see any kind of remuneration because somebody didn't get past that particular, didn't make it to being a manager from being a supervisor, unless you could prove it was positive discrimination, in which case, again, but that's for, individual or a group of people to take to a tribunal. So very different things. And again, the problem is that the terms that have been used by people, and I think it's in November, it's called Equal Pay Day, and it's not. It's actually the kind of gender representation day, when on average in the UK, that's when, that's the difference between a man and a woman's, average man and a woman's pay differential. So it's, again, it's very confusing for people out there, because a lot of the people that stand up and kind of shout about it are kind of talking about maybe slightly the wrong things. And maybe it comes to RL's point, which is it's very easy to be taken off track by things. So it's actually just about what we're trying to do, how we're going to achieve it, keep it on track. But yeah. Okay,
we do have another one, but we'll leave that till later, so you can finish off.
Right, this is a short section, nearly there. So this is basically, and again, this is not really my area of super duper expertise, but we've seen enough of it to give some good kind of clues. But nothing beats actually talking about this, doing it, and actually learning, and then telling everybody else what you've experienced. Now, that is alien in certain sectors as to giving over, the way you've done things and the way you've evolved. But actually, the best way for everybody to evolve is to learn from other people's mistakes. So I'll just give you what I've seen, and please take it for what it's meant. I think the most important thing is recognizing what needs to change. And the big thing here is, if you've got an ethnicity pay gap of 15%, you are not trying to change that number from 15%. That's not what you're trying to change. What you're trying to change is a process, a system, or a person or people, and overall the culture, to actually allow for a fairer representation of everybody throughout the pay range of your organization. So you're not chasing the number, you're chasing the actual outcomes. The numbers will eventually catch up, but it may take a fair few years for it to do so. So that's the first kind of big point. Again, this is very subjective, organization to organization. You've got to decide what good is for you. It will be very different in somewhere like London and Birmingham as far as representation, for somewhere like Edinburgh, with a massive disparity between the actual representation of different groups of people throughout the organization. So what looks good for you may look absolutely abysmal for somebody else. And really, this has got to be communicated. So the ambition, why are you doing it? What is good for us? Where do we want to get to? Needs to be known by everybody throughout the organization, so that everybody can buy into it. They may not agree with it, but at least they know that that's where senior leadership are going to take it. So it's then their decision if they want to be a part of it or not. Obviously, massive variance in sectors. Some sectors are getting, a lot better at it. Some sectors are really, really slow. And then you've got other sectors, without zeroing in on kind of finance and investment banks in particular, can be very reticent to actually give the raw data to HR teams to actually examine it. And actually, I know of organizations where the team that would be best placed, so HR, risk, ED&I, aren't actually given the granular detail of what people earn. And remember, when we say people, we're not asking for, you know, first names, last names, addresses, and mobile phone numbers. We're just asking for a kind of persona. They're not given that information, so they can't make the best decisions from it. So again, more transparency in terms of pay is definitely required to actually allow you to move towards what you think good is. So there will always be barriers, and you've just got to try and knock them down where you find them. And a good way to do this, as we've spoken about and answered questions on, is to set targets, but then focus on the outcomes and use the targets as a kind of, how are we doing? Are we actually, you know, are we actually making that progress? And when you're doing this, when you're setting targets, when you're deciding outcomes, you'll probably, when you do it in the first instance, be quite narrow in what you're setting. What you've got to try and do is, after that initial, you know, kind of planning session, is try and consider wider stakeholders. Is this appropriate for investors, for the media? Are we considering them? How are we considering the media? What about the people that are working for us at the moment? And then most importantly, what about the people that are looking at maybe having a career with us? So actually, you know, are we moving towards, are we being a 21st century company that's going to attract the best talent in the future, or are we more of a dinosaur? So that's really important. Evaluate the expertise around you and decide if you need any external support. That really does vary organization to organization. Some people, I dealt with a company yesterday that have their own internal HR analytics, et cetera, so, you know, they should have all the tools they need to do it. However, and the only thing I'd add to it, and it's not a sales pitch, is if you're going to get your annual accounts done, then you get somebody to do them and audit them and sign them off if you're a, you know, reasonably sized company. This should be moving towards that kind of path, just because it's so important. If you're not going to do that, then most definitely make sure that you are constantly learning and evolving what you're doing. You cannot be using the same process even to do gender pay gap analysis that you used in 2017 to 2021, because things are changing. So you need to stay on top of it. One of the easiest ways to stay on top of it is to, you know, stick close to specialists and actually, you know, go on that journey. And actually, you shouldn't be spending your time doing the nitty-gritty. You should be spending your time and thought on using the insights and outcomes to actually drive change, and use the ammunition of the right data presented in the right way to actually support your kind of progress. And then lastly, we've already said, I keep answering my own things, analyze your progress. You have to keep asking, not only, you know, asking, you know, are we doing this right, but also, is this looking okay for us? How are we doing? Is this on track to what we wanted? And then as you start to ask those questions, it becomes a kind of second nature to go, how are we compared to other people? And how are we compared? If we've got this representation, we open our front doors and walk outside, do who we are look exactly the same outside? Or actually, are we sadly lacking? And what can we do to actually fix this? And they will lead to some very fundamental questions. And there are some really, really good organizations in different sectors that are really going gangbusters and actually, you know, giving companies more of an option of where to get people from. You know, presenting them with interns and kind of graduate programs with people that they just wouldn't have got before in sectors that have, you know, in the past been quite closed off to that kind of thing, and actually putting them forward and going, this is a great person. They do not have an A from here and a, you know, degree from there, but this is a good person. And it's that kind of, you know, evolution that is actually means that you can go beyond just reporting a set of numbers and actually start to, you know, make actual changes in your organization. And that's it. I think probably what's easiest, if you're happy, is just to do the end bit, and then we'll cover off any questions after that.
Yep.
Okay, then. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Very well.
Thanks a lot, Anthony. That was excellent. Lots of information there and nuggets of knowledge that has been shared with us. And for individuals that have been on the journey since the first webinar, this is the I suppose the icing on the cake, cherry on the top to the trilogy of the series. Now, if we look at the ethnicity pay gap, this model designed by Diane to actually go with the hashtag ethnicity pay gap campaign and the process, you can see there are 4 columns. So you've got the pinnacle at the top, you know, analyzing your ethnicity pay gap, you know, and then the red band underneath it is the action to close the gap. So it's recognizing and then closing the gap. And then the 4 pillars are the key areas that individuals that want to take it forward or have those informed conversations can actually go through the process to actually look at it and take it forward. So the first one is review the data, then ask yourself, has the data identified any themes? Second column looks at how you establish a project team to look. Then as an organization and as a project team, you'd be creating a plan of action which will review the life cycle of the organization. And then lastly, engage with an external company to provide training, support, and or research to support you through the implementation process. And then there's the delivery band, and the delivery could be starting off with seminars, workshops, working groups, action learning sets, or even sort of focus groups to really look at the key areas and how you're going to, as an organization, as a project team, disseminate it, but also get it from concept to fruition. And then the last band is review and implement any action required to maintain equity. So throughout all of that, you think about what else is there that goes with it. And as part of it, you've got to think about that it's important that you have a clear vision of how you wish to close the ethnicity pay gap that exists within your, that doesn't exist in isolation. So there are other areas, and you know, I kind of like alluded to it in the question about getting organizations to really focus on, you know, changing the landscape that they've got. And one of the key things is around the staff surveys. They only focus on one thing when there's other things that they should be focusing on, but they only highlight the things that they want to, and then the rest of it is left as a disparity. So more work will need to be required to deep dive into the reasons behind your gap. There is evidence to suggest that gaps can be found through the life cycle of employment, i.e. recruitment, progression, promotion, and redundancy. So within each of these areas, it would be useful to review the level of equity amongst your employees. And this is for the leaders and the powers that be at the top. So then we look at transformational change. It may be required to help you to maximize on the findings of your analysis. So for more support and guidance, you can find it on the www.ethnicitypaygapcampaign.com website. There's a raft of information that Diane's put there that will give you an outline, and you can contact Diane directly and ask those informed questions. Right, okay, how do you join and support the hashtag Ethnicity Pay Gap campaign? Well, what you can do is use the hashtags, hashtag Ethnicity Pay Gap and Ethnicity Pay Gap Day on social media platforms such as LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also go on the equilibriummediation.com to purchase your t-shirt. And once you've purchased it, you can take a picture and send it through. So we'll showcase it and add it to the pictures of all the other people that are supporting the Ethnicity Pay Gap campaign. Start a conversation and encourage your organization to play a part in this change initiative. And it could be in team meetings, it could be in one-to-ones, and it could be in board meetings, depending on the level and the role and responsibility that you have. But you can also connect with us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and on Twitter. So we've got the accounts there. So if you do connect with us and tag us so that we can then share it with our networks, our connections as well. Thank you for attending. I know we've kind of like gone over time, but if you want to, you can stay on and we're happy to answer more questions because the team and Spectral are willing to do so.
I'm going to actually look at some of the questions from before that people were asking. So please bear with me while I look for. There was one from Robert that I'm trying to find because he was the last one I remember seeing. Unless Robert would like to say it himself. It's taken away. Oh, here we go. He said, and this is to you, Anthony, should companies set targets for representation of GEM employees at each level? Or did I answer that one? Or did you answer that one already?
We answered that one already.
Sorry. This is the one. I agree. I agree that representation is critical here. Do we need investors and regulators to put pressure on companies to change?
Yeah, so we're actually seeing the FCA are signalling, and there's a big difference between, you know, signalling and probably moving forward, but they are signalling the importance that they place on this. Obviously, you've got Section 172 of the Companies Act that is for bigger companies. They're being asked to provide a lot more information on, you know, how they're looking after their people, et cetera, et cetera. And with the FCA coming in to actually, you know, set some kind of, you know, their intent to say that this is fundamental. It's a start. You know, again, if you think about where we need to be and where we are, there's a huge chasm, but actually the fact that they're starting to say this is nothing but a good sign. So again, I think we are seeing some companies respond to it and to actually start doing, you know, ethnicity pay gap reports and you know, go further and actually start to analyze it properly. So, you know, anything that helps anybody, any kind of support that can stand behind something that should have been done a very long time ago is good.
Oh, brilliant. There's another message there from Ollie. Is there a place for embedding the ethnicity pay gap into the social value of contracts?
I'm not, Ollie, if you want to come on and actually say a bit more about that. I mean, the only thing I'm reading into that is, should line managers be held accountable for
yes. What I was thinking, I sort of knew the moment I wrote the question that it won't make any sense to anyone's reading it. But what I was thinking of is within a lot of the industries that we work in, you have service provider, you have a end user or client, and the client would typically put out these contracts, and they'd usually have a social value clause within the contract, which usually deals with things like social mobility, for example, within the area. I was just wondering if embedding something like this into, basically, if you are going to win a contract with this company, you ought to be a company that's already thinking about the ethnicity pay gap or has a way of addressing it. Perhaps it could be a way of encouraging service providers to start to look at it.
Yeah, so I'll give you some bad news first of all, or what I consider to be bad news, and then I'll give you a possible barrier, and then I'll give you my end thoughts. So the first thing is just look at the difference between the Modern Slavery Act and gender pay gap reporting legislation. On one hand, if you don't do your gender pay gap report, you'll get a letter from the EHRC. And on the other hand, if you don't conform to modern slavery, you will get shut down, you'll get investigated, the director will get sued, you'll have financial repercussions, etc. So there is a massive difference between the kind of the impetus that's been put behind it from the Home Office on one side of it, and then the GO on the other. It's totally different. I completely agree that choosing your supply chain should involve everything to do with fairness and equality. However, it's quite binary on things like modern slavery, because you ask people, have they got processes in place to make sure their supply chains are this and that? And it can be very binary. With things like ethnicity, disability, sexuality, everything like that, it really does depend on where you are as well. So as I said before, if we were in London and we had 100 people, you would expect us to have a fair representation of society. A fair representation of society in Edinburgh is very, very different. So actually, that's one area that you wouldn't want to have targets. But yeah, I do think there are certain things companies should have in place to actually demonstrate that, all things being equal, they are equal employers to different people, and do not hold barriers to people from very different walks of life actually, being a valued member of their organisation. But I think it's a tricky one. I think in the first instance, the best kind of progress has got to be existing companies going, we're taking this seriously, and actually we are going to hold ourselves to account. Then maybe regulators saying, we're going to hold you accountable. And then all of a sudden, the last vestiges of that are, okay, if you want to work with us, then you have to demonstrate. And we're already seeing that. So share activism, Share Action themselves, will stand up at, shareholder meetings and say, why have you only got 5% women on the board? Why have you not got this? Where's your representation of different ethnicities? So we are seeing that come from other angles. But again, that's got to be balanced against what's possible with the company.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Do we have any more questions?
We have another question. Well, there's one from Paul Irving. He says, modern slavery, why is that not one and the same with pay gap, slave wages? Question mark.
Again, I think we're getting confused with, that equality or inequality comes in very different guises. Some is very, very overt. So you've got child labor, etc., in another country, and a company over here that's taken advantage of it to reduce their costs. And then you've got a company that is saying, hey, we're representative of society. We've got 20% people that aren't white, and then you discover that they're all at the low end of the pay scale. There are none on the board, none in senior leadership at all, etc. So there's all manner of different things. At the end of the day, it is all the same. If it's not fair, it's not fair. However, there are very different signals and very different clues as to what area it is. I think the most important thing is to recognize what you're trying to solve for and go after that. A bit to RL's point, sometimes when you're after one particular thing and you get knocked off track, that can knock the whole of progress off track. So you've just got to decide how you're going to do it. And at the very start, you've got to recognize that this is not a thing that's going to be solved overnight, and it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to be a long journey to actually make progress. And but it doesn't mean it shouldn't be started, and it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done well and thought about.
Thank you very much, Anthony.
You're welcome.
I was going to say, you can ask questions of the Synergised team also. Don't be shy. He won't bite you. Yeah. If you'd like to, of course. Yeah. If there's anything else.
Yeah. So are there any more questions? I know we've gone over time. Right. Okay. If there aren't any more questions, then I'd just like to thank.
Heather,
is there one?
Heather saying, what's next for the Ethnicity Pay Gap campaign?
Thanks, Heather.
Interesting question. Well, I think what's next is basically just pushing for the government to make it mandatory. I'm having communication, or I had communications with equalities department in the government, and they sent me a very nice letter back to say thank you, we are looking into it and don't worry. But I'm worried, bearing in mind this report is exactly.
Nothing to see here, move along.
Exactly. The report has come out and it just says, oh, if you'd like to do your ethnicity pay gap, we'll help you, rather than no, this has to be mandatory and these are the reasons why. So, as far as I know, and as far as I'm concerned, we've got a long way to go, and I might be even grayer than I am now by the time we get to any solution.
I think the key to that, is really to start to take those tiny steps and have those informed discussions, and engage with the people who are the experts, Spectral, Synergised, Diane. We can help you around certain things, but you've got to have those conversations to start the process. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I think there's got, I think, what you're saying there exactly, there's got to be a willingness, hasn't there? There's got to be a willingness to make things happen. It's very difficult to knock on a door that's been bolted from the inside.
Yeah.
So, that is where the challenge is. I'm seeing a message from MYFXP.
Yeah, I'm just reading that right now.
It says, the way pay and pay increases are regulated between companies sometimes solidify ethnicity pay gap. Absolutely. Having HR push back on the pay offers or pay increases for employees that have historically been underpaid cause equality to be harder to achieve. For example, an employee that is currently being paid 40k for a role that on average pays 60k would struggle to have the gap closed because HR would generally look at the percentage increase required and wince at it. Absolutely right. And because I've actually been in a situation where I've been told, well, I should say told, the director told me to pay somebody higher than someone else. And, a lot of people within, I've got a HR degree, HR management degree. And some people in HR are not tough enough to kick back at their employers, or they're willing to do the employer's bidding. So, if the employer says, oh, we want to pay more, don't worry about it, they'll just carry on. Or as you said, they see the gap and they go, oh, well, we can't do anything about that. Well, actually, they probably could, but they just choose not to. So it's a, there are HR people who are for the people, and there are HR people who are for the organisation. And I suppose that's probably my way of just simplifying the thoughts around that. And you're absolutely right. It is a struggle, and a lot of it is to do with the way that systems are put in place. And I think, Anthony, you had made some mention of that as well, in terms of the systems and processes that are put in place that make these challenges happen.
Yeah, and that's why you need evidence to challenge a system, because it's very difficult to challenge a system because it can't talk back. But if you have evidence to say, actually, there is a growing gap, and obviously there is legislation. So in the US, I think it started in New York, it became illegal to ask somebody what they got paid in their previous role. I've seen recently on LinkedIn quite a lot of stuff about recruiters saying, don't try and ask me, on the sly about what the person received in their last job, etc., etc. So it is, if you think about it, a bias. That's exactly what bias is. You are bringing bias into when actually, if you're employing somebody, you should just be saying, what is the role? What's the band? What are you going to be doing? What's the responsibility? There's so much we're going to pay you. You shouldn't be basing that on what somebody got in their last job. Likewise, if you do discover that there is a huge disparity between what somebody's getting now and what they should be getting, then that needs normalizing. And it doesn't matter if it's a 5 or 50% increase. There should be a system that prevents that happening. If there isn't, that should be challenged, and it should be, well, if that person left tomorrow and went over there, they would be able to access that. So again, it needs to be looked at.
Yeah, I think that is, thank you very much for that, because I think that is a big problem, because having transitioned from the corporate world into the public sector healthcare, they automatically wanted to put me, at the bottom, and I had to negotiate. I said, no, I'm sorry, and I was quite tough-minded, but not everybody will have that knowledge or confidence in their own abilities and what they bring to the table to fight their cause. And they actually put me halfway up the pay spine, but that's a one-off in that respect, because once you're in there, then they think, right, okay, you're not going to get pay progression, and if you do, it's going to be incremental. So it's about, you know, making things a bit more transparent, but getting them to actually understand the impact that it has on their employees, because that's how they lose all of their best workforce.
Yeah.
There's an important question from Ollie. It says that a friend of mine was told that he would not be paid more because they would have to promote him, and there were already a lot of employees at the senior level. What would you advise him to do? Go where you're appreciated, mate. That's what I'd say.
That's what I would say. Yeah.
Definitely.
To me, that excuse ranks up with the sun was in my eyes, my dog ate my homework,
yeah,
etc.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Okay. Are there any more questions? If not, we're going to wrap up, and it just leaves me to thank Anthony Horrigan from Spectral for that fantastic presentation and outline that, you know, I can't bang on about the nuggets of knowledge. And thank Nicole for giving us the overview for the first and the second webinars. And I'll say to everybody that came on board, watch this space. You know, if you missed it, you missed out, but don't worry, it's coming round again like fashion. So we'll be back again, you know, but thank you very much. Go on, Diane.
And I'll say thanks to the host, Jacqueline, for being a great
You're
host.
welcome.
And,
thank you, Jacqueline.
Making it all run nice and smoothly. So from us, I'd like to say goodbye, and I hope everybody has a good weekend ahead.
Awesome.
And please do connect with us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.